The gymnasium at Naval Air Station Oceana smelled of rubber mats and decades of sweat. Admiral Marcus Hayworth stood at the center of the space, hands wrapped, shoulders loose. He'd flown off the Abraham Lincoln 3 days prior, another deployment behind him, another room full of ribbons on his chest that nobody questioned. 52 years old, square jaw, the kind of presence that made junior officers straighten their spines from across a hangar. He was waiting for someone, though nobody in the room understood why. The maintenance staff had been told to clear out by 1700. Most had. But one man remained, pushing a mop across the far corner near the locker rooms, moving with the methodical pace of someone who'd learned not to rush, not to be seen. His name was Julian Reeves, 38, divorced, single father to a 6-year-old daughter named Iris who waited for him every evening at the base childcare center. Julian wore the same blue coveralls he'd worn for 4 years, the same quiet expression that made people forget he existed. Except the Admiral had noticed him. 3 weeks prior, during a late-night walk through the maintenance bay, Hayworth had seen Julian working beneath the belly of an FA-18, hands moving with a precision that suggested more than janitorial work. There was something in the way he touched the aircraft, something familiar. Now in the gym, Hayworth called across the mats, "Reeves, you box." Julian looked up slowly, mop still in hand. His face was unreadable. Dark eyes, close-cropped hair going gray at the temples, a scar along his jawline that nobody had ever asked about. He didn't answer immediately. "I'm asking if you box," Hayworth repeated, louder this time, with the kind of voice that expected compliance. Julian set the mop against the wall. "Used to." "Good, I need a sparring partner. Nobody on base wants to hit an Admiral." Hayworth smiled, the kind of smile that assumed agreement. "Come on, just for fun." The gymnasium went quiet. 2 crew chiefs near the weight rack stopped mid-rep. A logistics officer pretended to stretch but was absolutely watching. Julian walked slowly across the mats, his boots squeaking on the polished floor. He moved like a man who'd learned to be invisible, but there was something underneath that something coiled. Hayworth tossed him a pair of gloves. "Let's see what you've got." Julian caught them without looking. For just a moment his eyes shifted, not toward the Admiral, toward the far wall where a faded photograph hung in a frame. It showed a squadron of pilots from 20 years prior standing in front of a carrier deck, arms crossed, faces young and certain. Nobody in the room had ever looked at it closely. Julian pulled on the gloves. The first round was careful. Hayworth circled, testing Julian's footwork, watching how he held his guard. Julian moved economically, no wasted motion, his shoulders angled in a way that suggested training far beyond a weekend gym habit. He didn't swing. He waited. Hayworth jabbed twice, testing distance. Julian slipped both punches with minimal effort, his head moving just enough. The Admiral grinned. "You've done this before." Julian didn't respond. His face remained expressionless, eyes tracking Hayworth's shoulders, his hips, reading telegraphs most amateur fighters never noticed. When Hayworth threw a right cross, Julian parried it cleanly and countered with a body shot that landed just below the ribs, not hard but precise. Hayworth exhaled sharply, surprised. Okay, you're legit." They reset. The gym was filling now. Word had spread through the base grapevine that an Admiral was sparring a janitor and personnel were drifting in, pretending to work out but really just watching. A few junior officers whispered near the door. One of them, Lieutenant Ava Renfield, arms crossed, blonde hair pulled back tight, watched Julian with narrow eyes. She'd seen him before, cleaning the ready room, wiping down tables in the officers' mess. She'd never thought twice about him. Now, watching him move, she thought something else. Hayworth pushed harder. He threw combinations, mixing levels, trying to overwhelm Julian's defense. But Julian absorbed everything. He didn't counter much. He didn't need to. His defense was airtight, his movement fluid, his breathing controlled. He looked like a man who'd spent years in the ring or somewhere worse. After 3 rounds, Hayworth pulled off his gloves, breathing hard, smiling wide. "Jesus, where'd you learn to fight like that?" Julian's expression didn't change. He pulled off his own gloves and handed them back. "Long time ago." "Military." Julian hesitated, just a heartbeat, something like that. Hayworth studied him, curiosity sharpening into something more focused. "You serve?" "Yes, sir." "What branch?" Julian turned toward the mop he'd left against the wall. "Navy." "What rate?" Julian picked up the mop. His back was to the Admiral now, his shoulders tense in a way that hadn't been there during the sparring. "Aviation." Hayworth's smile faded. He took a step closer. "Wait, you flew." Julian didn't answer. He started pushing the mop again, slow, deliberate strokes, his face angled down. The crowd that had gathered began to disperse, sensing the conversation had shifted into something private. But Lieutenant Renfield stayed. She was staring at Julian now, her mind working through something, some connection she couldn't quite place. Hayworth didn't let it go. "Reeves, if you flew, why the hell are you pushing a mop?" Julian stopped. He didn't turn around. His voice, when it came, was quiet. "Because it's the only job they'd give me." The gymnasium felt suddenly colder. Hayworth frowned. "What does that mean?" Julian set the mop down again. Slowly, he turned. His face was still unreadable, but there was something in his eyes now, something old and tired. "I flew F-14s off the Nimitz, sir, 22 years ago. Call sign Wraith." The name hit the room like a shockwave. Lieutenant Renfield's eyes went wide. She took an involuntary step forward. "Wraith, you're your Wraith." Julian looked at her for the first time. His expression didn't change. Hayworth's face had gone pale. "Wraith, Jesus Christ, you're Julian Reeves." "Yes, sir." "You were." Hayworth stopped, his mind racing through 20-year-old stories, legends whispered in ready rooms, incidents buried in classified reports. "You were at Kandahar, the friendly fire incident." Julian's jaw tightened. "Yes, sir." The room was silent now. Renfield's hand had gone to her mouth. The few personnel still lingering near the weights had frozen, eyes wide. Everyone in naval aviation knew the story. Everyone knew the call sign. "Wraith." The pilot who'd accidentally killed 6 Marines. Hayworth's voice dropped. "They grounded you." "Permanently." "And you stayed in." Julian's eyes flicked toward the photograph on the wall. "I had a daughter. I needed the job. They offered me maintenance, then janitorial." He paused. "I took it." Hayworth stared at him, struggling to process. The man in front of him wasn't what he'd expected. There was no bitterness in his voice, no anger, just a kind of quiet resignation that felt worse than rage. "Why didn't you fight it?" Hayworth asked. "The investigation cleared you. The strike package was bad intel. You followed orders." Julian picked up his mop again. "Cleared doesn't mean forgiven, sir." Lieutenant Ava Renfield couldn't sleep that night. She lay in her rack aboard the carrier, staring at the ceiling, her mind circling the same question. How does a decorated pilot end up pushing a mop for 2 decades? She'd pulled Julian's service record after the gym. It took 3 clearance levels and a favor from a friend in personnel, but she'd found it. What she read made her stomach turn. Lieutenant Julian Reeves, naval aviator, graduated top of his class from Pensacola, assigned to VF-143, the Pukin Dogs, flying F-14 Tomcats off the USS Nimitz, 17 combat missions, 3 confirmed kills, a promising career, then Kandahar. The mission brief had been clean. Provide close air support for a Marine unit pinned down by Taliban forces in a mountain valley. Coordinates confirmed. Authorization granted. Julian had rolled in, dropped a 500-pound GBU, and watched the target building disintegrate. Except it wasn't Taliban. It was a safe house. 6 Marines taking cover from a separate firefight 3 clicks east. The intel package had been wrong. The coordinates had been wrong. The entire mission architecture had been catastrophically wrong. Julian had followed orders. 6 men died anyway. The investigation had exonerated him. Technically, command failures, they'd called it, systemic breakdown in forward air control protocols. Julian was cleared of criminal negligence, but the Corps didn't forgive. The families didn't forgive. And somewhere deep in the labyrinth of naval politics, someone decided Julian Reeves would never fly again. They'd offered him a desk job. He'd refused. They'd offered him an honorable discharge. He'd refused, so they buried him. Maintenance. Then janitorial. 22 years of penance, mopping floors on the same base where he'd once briefed combat missions. Renfield closed the file and sat in the dark, her jaw tight. She'd flown 73 combat sorties. She knew what it felt like to drop ordnance, to watch the world explode beneath your wings, to trust that the people feeding you coordinates weren't wrong. She knew how thin the line was, how easily it could be her. She made a decision. The next morning, Renfield found Admiral Hayworth in the operations center, reviewing strike packages for the upcoming deployment. She stood at attention until he acknowledged her. "Lieutenant." "Sir, I'd like to request permission to access personnel files related to aviation maintenance qualifications." Hayworth looked up, eyes sharp. "Why?" "Julian Reeves, sir, Wraith." Hayworth leaned back in his chair. "What about him?" "He's qualified, sir. He's been maintaining our birds for 4 years. He knows these aircraft better than half the crew chiefs, and before that he flew them." She paused. "I think we're wasting him." Hayworth studied her. "You want to put him back in a cockpit?" "I want to put him where he belongs." "He's grounded, Lieutenant, permanently." "By order of an admiral who retired 12 years ago." Renfield's voice was calm but firm. "There's no active restriction in his file, just a career reassignment." Hayworth's eyebrows rose. "You checked?" "Yes, sir." He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the desk. Finally, he sighed. "Even if I could reinstate him, why would he want it? He's been on the ground for 22 years. He's got a daughter, a life. Why drag him back?" Renfield met his eyes. "Because he never stopped being a pilot, sir. I've watched him. The way he moves around those jets, the way he looks at them. He's still flying. He just doesn't have wings." Julian was wiping down the canopy of an FA-18 when Renfield found him. The flight line was quiet, mid-afternoon lull, most of the deck crew at chow. He worked alone, methodical, his hands moving over the plexiglass with the kind of care most people reserved for things they loved. "Wraith." He didn't look up. "That's not my call sign anymore." Renfield climbed the ladder and stood on the opposite side of the canopy, looking at him through the glass. "Admiral Hayworth wants to talk to you." "About what?" "About flying." Julian stopped. His cloth hovered over the canopy, motionless. Slowly he looked up. His face was unreadable, but his eyes had changed. There was something there, something he'd buried for 2 decades. "I don't fly." "You could." "No, I can't." Renfield leaned closer. "There's no active restriction in your file, Wraith. You were reassigned, not grounded. Hayworth's willing to push for reinstatement." Julian climbed down the ladder. His hands were shaking slightly, though he hid it by wiping them on his coveralls. "Why?" "Because you're wasting your life." He turned on her, and for the first time there was heat in his voice. "I killed 6 Marines, Lieutenant. I don't get to fly anymore. That's the deal. You followed orders, bad orders, that's not on you. Tell that to their families." Renfield stepped closer, her voice dropping. "I've flown 73 sorties. I've dropped ordnance on coordinates I trusted were right. Every single time I knew there was a chance they were wrong. Every single time I knew I could end up just like you." She paused. "The only difference between us is luck." Julian looked away. "I have a daughter, I can't." "Your daughter deserves to see who you really are." That hit him. He stood there silent, his jaw working. Finally, he shook his head. "I can't, I'm sorry." He walked away, leaving Renfield standing on the flight line, frustration burning in her chest. Iris Reeves was 6 years old, small for her age, with dark curls and her father's serious eyes. She sat in the base childcare center every afternoon, coloring pictures of airplanes while she waited for Julian to finish his shift. She drew them obsessively. F-14s mostly, though she didn't know that's what they were called. She just knew they looked like the model on her father's dresser, the one he never talked about. She didn't understand why her father cleaned floors. She'd asked once. He'd said it was important work, that someone had to do it. But she'd seen the way he looked at the jets when they walked past the flight line. She'd seen the way his hands moved when he explained how wings worked, how engines breathed, how pilots thought. She knew he wasn't really a janitor. One evening, after Julian picked her up, they sat together in the base park, watching the sun set over the airfield. A pair of FA-18s roared overhead, afterburners glowing orange against the dimming sky. Iris watched them, transfixed. "Daddy, did you used to fly those?" Julian didn't answer immediately. He watched the jets disappear into the distance, his face shadowed. Finally, he nodded. "A long time ago." "Why did you stop?" He looked down at her, and for a moment his carefully constructed armor cracked. "I made a mistake, a big one." "What kind of mistake?" "The kind you don't come back from." Iris frowned, thinking. Then she said very seriously, "Mommy says everybody makes mistakes. She says that's how you learn." Julian's throat tightened. "Some mistakes cost too much, sweetheart." Iris leaned against him, her small hand finding his. "I think you should fly again." He closed his eyes. That night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling of his small base apartment, Julian thought about what Renfield had said. About luck, about wasted lives, about who he really was. He thought about the 6 Marines. He thought about Iris, drawing airplanes every single day. At 0300 he got up, walked to his closet, and pulled out a box he hadn't opened in years. Inside was his flight suit, his helmet, his wings. He held them in his hands, feeling the weight of 22 years pressing down on his chest. Then he made a decision. Admiral Hayworth was in his office when Julian knocked. It was 0600, early enough that most of the base was still asleep. Hayworth looked up, surprised, then gestured to the chair across from his desk. Julian sat. He didn't speak immediately. Hayworth waited. Finally, Julian said, "If you're serious about reinstatement, I need to know why." Hayworth leaned back. "Because you're the best pilot I've ever seen who's not flying." "You've never seen me fly." "I saw you box. Same thing, economy of motion, perfect timing, instinct." Hayworth paused. "And I pulled your combat record, 17 missions, 3 kills, 0 mistakes until Kandahar. That's not luck, that's skill." Julian's jaw tightened. Kandahar was enough. Kandahar was a command failure. You were the scapegoat. I still pulled the trigger. Following orders. That doesn't bring them back. Hayworth leaned forward, his voice hardening. "No, it doesn't, but wasting the next 20 years doesn't honor them either. You want penance? Fine, fly again. Be so goddamn good that nobody ever questions a strike package again. Train the next generation to be better. That's how you make it mean something." Julian stared at him. "I have a daughter." "I know, and right now she's watching you hide." Hayworth's voice softened. "What do you want her to learn from you?" Julian closed his eyes. When he opened them, something had shifted. "What do I need to do?" Hayworth smiled. "Pass a flight physical, pass a qualification board, then prove you can still fly." Julian stood. "When do we start?" "Tomorrow, 0700, be ready." As Julian reached the door, Hayworth called after him, "Wraith." Julian turned. "Welcome back." The news spread through the base like wildfire. Wraith was flying again. The legend. The ghost. The man who'd been buried for 22 years was climbing back into a cockpit. Reactions were mixed. Some of the older pilots remembered him, remembered the stories. They were cautiously supportive. Others, especially younger aviators who'd grown up hearing the Kandahar story, were skeptical. A few were openly hostile. Lieutenant Commander Derek Voss was the loudest. 34, hotshot FA-18 pilot, 3 deployments, a wall of medals, and an ego to match. He cornered Renfield in the ready room 2 days before Julian's qualification flight. "You seriously backing this guy?" Renfield didn't look up from her mission brief. "Yes. He killed 6 Marines. He followed bad orders. He should have known better." Now Renfield looked up, her eyes cold. "You ever been given coordinates in a hot LZ, Voss? Ever had 30 seconds to decide if the intel's good? Ever wondered if the building you're about to flatten has friendlies inside?" Voss's jaw tightened. "I trust my controllers." So did he. Renfield stood, closing the distance between them. "The difference is you've been lucky. He wasn't. And if you think that makes you better, you're a fool." Voss stared at her, then turned and walked out. But Renfield's words stuck with him. That night, alone in his rack, he thought about every mission he'd flown, every bomb he'd dropped. He thought about how thin the margin was, how easily it could be him. He didn't sleep well. The next morning, he found Julian on the flight line, running pre-flight checks on an FA-18. Voss watched from a distance, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Julian moved around the aircraft with a fluidity that belied his age, his hands checking control surfaces, his eyes scanning for hydraulic leaks, his entire body language speaking a fluency that 22 years on the ground hadn't erased. Voss approached slowly. "You really think you can still do this?" Julian looked up. His face was calm. "I guess we'll find out." "You're 52. And you're 34 with a chip on your shoulder." Julian straightened. "What's your point?" Voss blinked, surprised by the directness. "My point is you've been out of the game for 2 decades. Flying's changed. These birds aren't F-14s. The systems, the tactics, the threats, it's all different." Julian nodded. "You're right, so I'll learn." "Just like that. Just like that." Voss studied him, searching for arrogance, for overconfidence. He found neither, just a quiet certainty that was somehow more unsettling. Why now? Why after all this time? Julian glanced toward the base childcare center, barely visible in the distance. "Because I want my daughter to know who I am." Voss didn't have a response to that. He stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked away. But something had shifted in him. He wasn't sure what it was yet. Julian's qualification flight was scheduled for 0900 on a Tuesday. The flight line was crowded. Word had spread, and personnel from across the base had found reasons to be nearby. Admiral Hayworth stood in the tower, arms crossed, watching through the glass. Lieutenant Renfield was in the ready room, monitoring comms. Even Voss was there, leaning against a bulkhead, pretending not to care. Julian walked across the tarmac in a flight suit that hadn't seen sunlight in 22 years. It fit differently now, tighter across the shoulders, looser in the waist, but it still felt like home. His helmet was tucked under his arm, his face calm. He climbed the ladder slowly, methodically, his hands moving through the pre-flight ritual with muscle memory that time hadn't touched. In the cockpit, he paused. His hands rested on the throttle and stick, feeling the texture, the weight. He closed his eyes and took a breath. Then he powered up. The FA-18's engines whined to life, a sound he'd heard 1,000 times in dreams. His hands moved across the panel, flipping switches, checking displays, his mind falling into a rhythm that felt like breathing. Tower crackled in his headset. "Wraith, you are cleared for taxi." He keyed the mic. "Copy Tower, Wraith taxiing." His voice was steady, calm, the voice of a man who'd been here before. He taxied to the runway, completed his final checks, and waited for clearance. Wraith winds 270 at 12. You are cleared for takeoff. Julian pushed the throttles forward. The FA-18 surged, acceleration pressing him back into the seat. The runway blurred, the nose lifted, and then silence. The kind of silence that only exists when you leave the ground. He was flying. For the first time in 22 years, Julian Reeves was flying. And he remembered why he'd never stopped being a pilot. The flight was supposed to be simple. A standard proficiency check, basic maneuvers, navigation, systems checks. Nothing fancy, just prove he could handle the aircraft. But Julian wasn't interested in simple. At 15,000 feet, he rolled inverted and held it, feeling the blood rush to his head, feeling the aircraft respond to his inputs with a precision that made his chest ache. He pulled into a chandelle, a climbing turn that bled energy perfectly, transitioning into a lazy 8 that carved the sky like calligraphy. In the tower, Hayworth's eyes narrowed. What's he doing? The air boss checked his radar. Looks like aerobatics, sir. He's supposed to be doing a proficiency check. He's doing that too, sir, just better. On the flight line, personnel stopped what they were doing and looked up. The FA-18 was dancing, tracing patterns against the blue that hadn't been seen in years. Clean lines, perfect angles, the kind of flying that looked effortless but required absolute mastery. In the ready room, Voss stared at the monitor, his jaw tight. Jesus Christ. Renfield smiled. That's Wraith. Julian leveled out at 20,000 feet, his breathing calm, his heart steady. He felt the aircraft around him, felt the air flowing over the wings, felt the engines pulse through the frame. This was what he'd been missing. Not the adrenaline, not the glory, just this. The purity of flight. The conversation between pilot and machine that existed beyond words. He keyed the mic. Tower, Wraith requesting clearance for tactical approach. There was a pause, then Hayworth's voice dry and amused. Denied, Wraith, bring it home clean. Julian grinned. Copy, sir. He descended, entered the pattern, and brought the FA-18 in for a landing so smooth the gear barely chirped. He taxied back to the line, shut down the engines, and climbed out. The tarmac was silent. Then someone started clapping. Then another. Within seconds, the entire flight line was applauding. Personnel from every rate, every rank, standing and clapping for the man who'd been invisible for 22 years. Julian stood on the wing, helmet under his arm, his face unreadable. But his eyes were shining. Hayworth met him on the tarmac. Show off. Julian smiled, a real smile, the first in years. Had to make sure I still could. You can, Hayworth extended his hand. Welcome back, Wraith. Julian shook it. Thank you, sir. Behind them, Voss approached slowly. He stopped a few feet away, hands in his pockets, his expression complicated. That was good flying. Julian nodded. Thanks. Voss hesitated, then added, I was wrong about you. You were protecting your people, I get it. Still, I was wrong. Voss extended his hand. Let's start over. Julian shook it. Deal. As the crowd dispersed, Renfield appeared at Julian's side. How'd it feel? Julian looked up at the sky, squinting against the sun. Like coming home. That evening, Julian picked up Iris from childcare. She saw him coming and ran, throwing her arms around his waist. He lifted her up, holding her tight. How was your day? She asked. Good, really good. What you do? Julian set her down and knelt, looking her in the eyes. I flew today, sweetheart. Iris's face lit up. Really? Really? Did you like it? Julian nodded, his throat tight. Yeah, I did. Iris hugged him again, squeezing hard. I'm proud of you, Daddy. Julian closed his eyes, holding his daughter, feeling something inside him that had been broken for 22 years start to heal. That night he called his ex-wife. It had been years since they'd spoken. She'd remarried, moved to Oregon, built a new life. But she answered. Julian. Hey, Mara. Silence, then cautiously, is everything okay? Yeah, I wanted you to know I flew today. Another pause, longer this time. You're flying again. Yeah. He could hear her breathe, could almost see her standing in her kitchen processing. How? Long story, but I needed to tell you, needed you to know. Julian, her voice softened. I'm glad, I really am. Thanks. Is Iris okay? She's great, she's proud of me. Mara laughed, a small, sad sound. She should be, you're a good dad. I'm trying. They talked for another 20 minutes, not about the past, not about mistakes, just about Iris, about life, about small things that used to matter. When they hung up, Julian felt lighter. He walked to Iris's room and found her asleep, a drawing of an airplane clutched in her hand. He kissed her forehead, turned off the light and stood in the doorway, watching her breathe. He was flying again. And for the first time in 22 years, Julian Reeves believed he deserved it. 3 weeks later, Admiral Hayworth called Julian into his office. This time, the Admiral wasn't alone. A woman sat across from his desk, mid-50s, sharp eyes, wearing a civilian suit. She stood when Julian entered. Commander Reeves, this is Dr. Samantha Coe. She's from Naval Special Warfare. Julian shook her hand, confused. Special Warfare. Coe smiled. Not what you think. I run a program that evaluates high-risk assets for specialized deployment. She gestured to a chair. Please sit. Julian sat, his mind racing. Hayworth watched him carefully. Coe opened a tablet and scrolled through data. Your recent flight qualification was impressive, top marks across all categories, but what caught our attention was your time. You've been maintaining aircraft for 4 years. Before that, flight deck operations for 18 years. You know these birds inside and out. I do my job. You do more than that, Coe looked up. We've been monitoring casualty rates in close air support missions. Friendly fire incidents are down, but they still happen. 1 every 8 months on average. Each time it's the same issue. Bad intel, miscommunication, pilots trusting coordinates they shouldn't. Julian's chest tightened. What's this about? We want to build a program, a cross-training initiative between pilots and ground controllers, real-time coordination, better communication. The goal is to reduce that casualty rate to 0. She paused. We want you to run it. Julian stared at her. Me. You understand both sides. You've lived the consequences. You're the perfect person to teach others how to avoid what happened to you. Julian looked at Hayworth, who nodded. It's a good program, Wraith, and it needs someone who cares. Julian was silent for a long moment. Then, quietly, he said, I'm not sure I'm ready to talk about Kandahar. Coe leaned forward. You don't have to relive it, you just have to teach from it, help the next generation be better. She hesitated, then added, the families of the 6 Marines. 2 of them have sons in the Corps now. One's a forward air controller. He's the one who suggested this program. He wants to learn from you. Julian's breath caught. He knows who I am. He does, and he doesn't blame you. Julian closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. What's his name? Corporal James Davitt. His father was Sergeant Michael Davitt. Kandahar, 2003. Julian remembered. Sergeant Davitt, 24 years old, married, a daughter on the way. He stood abruptly, his hands shaking. I need a minute. Hayworth nodded. Take your time. Julian walked out into the hallway, his mind spinning. He stood there, breathing hard, trying to process. Then his phone buzzed. A text from Renfield. Heard about the program. You should do it. He stared at the message. Then he walked back into Hayworth's office. I'll do it, he said, on one condition. Coe raised an eyebrow. What's that? I meet Corporal Davitt first. Before anything starts, I need to talk to him. Coe and Hayworth exchanged glances. Then Coe nodded. Deal. Corporal James Davitt was 26 years old, lean and serious, with his father's eyes. He stood at attention when Julian entered the briefing room at Camp Lejeune, his face carefully neutral. Julian stopped a few feet away. At ease, Corporal. David relaxed slightly but didn't sit. They stood facing each other, the weight of history pressing down on the room. Julian spoke first. I killed your father. David's jaw tightened. You followed orders. That doesn't change what happened. No, it doesn't. They were silent. Then David said very carefully, I grew up hating you. I spent years imagining what I'd say if I ever met you, what I'd do. He paused. But then I joined the Corps and I started calling in airstrikes, and I realized how thin the margin is, how easy it is to get it wrong. His voice dropped. I don't hate you anymore, I just wish it hadn't happened. Julian's throat was tight. So do I. But it did, and we can't change that. David finally sat, gesturing for Julian to do the same. So let's make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. Julian sat slowly. Your mother. She knows I'm doing this. She approves. David hesitated. She said my father would want this, would want something good to come from it. Julian couldn't speak. He just nodded. They talked for 2 hours, about tactics, about communication, about the mistakes that had been made and the systems that had failed, and slowly, carefully, they built the foundation of something new. When Julian left, David shook his hand. Thank you for doing this. Thank you for letting me. Julian drove back to Oceana in silence, his mind full. When he arrived home, Iris was waiting, coloring at the kitchen table. She looked up and smiled. Daddy, I drew you flying. Julian knelt beside her, looking at the picture. It showed an airplane, an FA-18, surprisingly accurate, soaring above clouds. In the cockpit, a stick figure with a smile. It's perfect, sweetheart. Iris beamed. Are you happy now? Julian pulled her close. Yeah, I think I am. That night he stood on his balcony, looking up at the stars, thinking about Sergeant David, about his son, about the strange alchemy that turns tragedy into purpose. He thought about the 6 Marines, about the families they'd left behind, about the weight he'd carried for 22 years. And he thought about the future, about the pilots he'd train, about the lives he might save. The weight didn't disappear, it never would, but it felt different now, bearable, meaningful. Julian Reeves closed his eyes and breathed the night air. He was ready. The program launched 6 months later. It was called JASFOR, Joint Aviation Strike Force Operations and Refinement. The name was bureaucratic and forgettable, but the substance was revolutionary. Pilots and forward air controllers trained together, learned each other's languages, walked through scenarios until coordination became instinct. Julian ran it with a quiet intensity that earned immediate respect. He didn't lecture. He didn't preach. He just showed them what happened when communication failed, when assumptions went unchecked, when speed overrode caution. And he showed them how to be better. Lieutenant Renfield was his second in command. She'd volunteered immediately, and her tactical mind complemented Julian's operational experience perfectly. Together, they built a training regimen